South African Airways is broke. Kenya Airways continue struggling. But one African airline pulling in $7.6 billion a year. Not from Lagos, not from Johannesburg, not from Nairobi, from Addis Ababa, a landlocked country where the GDP per capita is roughly $1,100. Ethiopian Airlines isn't just surviving, it's generating more revenue than Finnair, Norwegian, and Air New Zealand. It stayed profitable through COVID without a single government bailout. So, if every ingredient for airline success in Africa is supposedly missing – weak infrastructure, unstable governments, thin demand, brutal economics – how is a state-owned carrier from one of the world's poorest countries systematically destroying every competitor on the continent? The answer isn't luck, it isn't oil money, and it isn't some secret the rest of Africa doesn't have access to. It's a playbook, vertical integration, hub exploitation, decades-long planning that's been sitting in plain sight since 1945. A fleet of over 150 aircraft, a $6 billion mega airport under construction, an aviation academy graduating hundreds of professionals a year, and a vision plan targeting $25 billion in revenue and 65 million passengers. On paper, this shouldn't work. An emperor's pet project born from 5 surplus World War II cargo planes and a management contract with TWA turned into Africa's only global supercarrier. In reality, every other African flag carrier had more money, bigger economies, and stronger partners. None of them could do what Ethiopian Airlines did. So, what went right on Addis Ababa, and what went so catastrophically wrong everywhere else? The answer begins paradoxically with a decision made by an emperor. On December 21, 1945, Haile Selassie I established what was then known as Ethiopian Airlines with a deliberate strategic vision. Ethiopia had never been colonized, and Selassie understood that a national airline was more than transportation. It was a statement of sovereignty and a tool for connecting a landlocked nation to the world. The partnership with TWA was critical. TWA didn't just provide aircraft, it provided American aviation standards, pilot training, maintenance protocols, and management systems. This was fundamentally different from the colonial-era airlines established across the rest of Africa, which were typically branches of European carriers designed to serve the metropole, not the continent. When independence swept across Africa in the 1960s, these carriers were handed over to new governments that often lacked the institutional knowledge to run them. Ethiopian, by contrast, was building that institutional knowledge from the start. By the late 1960s, the management contract with TWA had been fully transitioned. By the airline's 25th anniversary in 1971, Colonel Semret Medhane had become the first Ethiopian general manager, and the entire operation was staffed by Ethiopian personnel. This was an extraordinary milestone, one that most African carriers wouldn't achieve for decades, if ever. What happened next would have destroyed almost any other airline. The Marxist Derg regime overthrew the emperor in 1974, plunging Ethiopia into civil war. The government aligned with the Soviet Union. Western nations looked away, and yet Ethiopian Airlines kept flying. It continued acquiring aircraft. It operated with a degree of commercial autonomy that defied the ideological chaos surrounding it. This resilience wasn't accidental. It reflected something embedded in the airline's DNA from its inception, the principle that commercial management should remain insulated from political interference. It's a principle that 7 decades later still separates Ethiopian from virtually every other state-owned African carrier. Fast forward to 2005, Ethiopian Airlines was profitable, but modest, generating under $1 billion in annual revenue with a fleet of 32 aircraft. Then, the airline's leadership did something almost unheard of in African aviation. They wrote a plan, and then they executed it. Vision 2010 set a target of $1 billion in revenue. The airline hit $1.3 billion. Emboldened, they launched Vision 2025, a 15-year roadmap to become the leading aviation group in Africa. The targets were ambitious: a fleet of over 120 aircraft, revenue exceeding $10 billion, and a network spanning more than 90 international destinations. They achieved fleet and network targets years ahead of schedule and surpassed the revenue goal by the mid-2020s. The key insight behind the plans was that Ethiopian Airlines should not operate as merely an airline. It should function as a diversified aviation group with 7 distinct profit centers: international passenger services, cargo and logistics, maintenance, repair and overhaul, an aviation academy, in-flight catering, ground handling services, and airports enterprise. Each division generates its own revenue. Each insulates the other from volatility. When passenger demand collapsed during COVID, the cargo division surged. When third-party MRO providers raised prices across Africa, Ethiopia's own maintenance facility, the largest on the continent, kept costs controlled internally. This vertical integration, it's what separates Ethiopian from carriers that look similar on a route map, but are fundamentally different businesses. South African Airways outsourced much of its maintenance, relied on government bailouts, and allowed political appointees to make commercial decisions. Kenya Airways entered a convoluted public-private partnership, took investment from KLM, and still couldn't turn a profit for nearly a decade, until 2024. Ethiopian, meanwhile, reinvested its own profits, raised its own debt, and trained its own people. The Ethiopian Aviation Academy, established in 1956, has graduated tens of thousands of pilots, technicians, and cabin crew from across the continent. In January 2026 alone, it graduated 457 aviation professionals from 12 countries. It's a strategic investment that reduces dependence on expensive expatriate labor and builds the human capital pipeline that sustains the airline's growth. But the most consequential element of Ethiopian's strategy is geographic. Addis Ababa sits at the crossroads of Africa, Europe and the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. For passengers traveling between West Africa and East Asia, or between Southern Africa and Europe, a connection through Addis Ababa is a great option. Ethiopian recognized this advantage and ruthlessly exploited it. The strategy mirrors what Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Turkish Airlines have done from their respective hubs. Use geographic position to capture connecting traffic that doesn't originate in or terminate at the hub city itself. A passenger flying from Accra to Shanghai doesn't need to go through Addis Ababa for any reason other than the fact that Ethiopian offers the most convenient connection, but that is enough. Today, Ethiopian serves more than 140 international destinations and over 20 domestic ones. Its network blankets the African continent in a way that no Gulf carrier can match. While Emirates might offer a daily wide-body to Lagos or Nairobi, Ethiopian serves dozens of smaller African cities that would never justify a Gulf carrier's attention. Places like Lilongwe, Lusaka, Entebbe, and Lome. These routes aren't glamorous, but they feed passengers into the Addis Ababa hub for onward connections to London, Washington, Shanghai, and everywhere in between. To deepen this network, Ethiopian has taken equity shares in regional carriers across the continent. It holds 49% of Air Congo, approximately 40% of ASKY Airlines in Togo, 49% of Guinea Airways, 49% of Malawi Airlines, and 45% of Zambia Airways. These aren't vanity investments, they're feeder networks. Each of these carriers channels traffic into Addis Ababa, strengthening the hub's gravity. The fleet tells the story of where Ethiopian is headed. The airline has ordered over 80 aircraft across multiple manufacturers and types. This includes Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners, Boeing 737 MAX 8s, Airbus A350-900s, and critically, 8 Boeing 777-9 aircraft, making Ethiopian the first African customer for the 777X. There are options and letters of intent that push the total even higher. The mixed fleet strategy is deliberate. By maintaining both Airbus and Boeing aircraft in its inventory, Ethiopian strengthens its negotiating position with both manufacturers. This dual-source approach also allows the airline to match aircraft precisely to route demand: A350s for ultra-long-haul routes, 787s for medium-haul intercontinental services, 737 MAX 8s for intra-African connectivity, and Dash 8 400 turboprops for domestic routes. The airline has also been evaluating 20 to 30 additional regional jets in the 100-seat class, considering the Airbus A220, Embraer E2, and Boeing 737 MAX 7. These would replace aging aircraft and boost service to secondary African cities, further thickening the hub's spoke network. Perhaps the most audacious element of Ethiopian's future, however, sits 40 kilometers north of Addis Ababa. Construction has begun on the Bishoftu International Airport, a mega project estimated at over $6 billion in its initial phase, with total costs potentially reaching $10 to $12 billion, designed to ultimately handle 110 million passengers annually across 4 runways. Ethiopian Airlines is funding approximately 20 to 30% of the project itself, with the African Development Bank leading financial arrangements for the remainder. If the first phase is completed as planned around 2030, it would be the largest airport in Africa by an enormous margin. The scale is staggering. Current Bole International Airport handles more than 20 million passengers and is already straining at capacity. The new airport would represent a massive increase in capacity, a bet that Africa's aviation market will grow dramatically, and that Ethiopian will capture the lion's share of it. The clearest evidence of Ethiopian's structural superiority over its rivals came during COVID-19. While SAA entered business rescue and Kenya Airways hemorrhaged cash, Ethiopian Airlines did something remarkable. It stayed profitable. Without government bailouts, without mass layoffs, the airline converted 25 passenger aircraft into temporary freighters by removing seats, creating so-called freighters to transport PPE, medical supplies, and general cargo. Cargo revenue surged to roughly half of total revenue during the peak of the crisis. This wasn't improvisation, it was the aviation group model, functioning exactly as designed. The ground service division managed the logistics. The cargo division already had relationships with global freight forwarders. Every piece of the vertical integrated machine worked in concert. By the time international travel recovered, Ethiopian emerged with its fleet intact, its workforce retained, and its balance sheet healthy. Competitors emerged weakened, shrunken, or fundamentally restructured. The financial and operational record remains undeniable. Under Vision 2035, it targets 65 million annual passengers and a fleet of 271 aircraft. Under the even more ambitious Vision 2040, those targets stretch to 303 aircraft and 243 destinations. The question is not whether Ethiopian Airlines is Africa's most successful carrier. That is beyond dispute. The question is why no one else on the continent has managed to replicate even a fraction of its model. The ingredients are not a secret: operational autonomy, vertical integration across the aviation value chain, long-term strategic planning measured in decades rather than quarters, investment in human capital, geographic exploitation of hub positioning. Every one of these principles is available to any state-owned African carrier. Neither could make it work. The failure was not one of the resources, but of governance, of allowing political interests to override commercial logic, of treating national airlines as patronage vehicles rather than competitive enterprises. Ethiopian Airlines didn't beat everyone by doing something no one else could do. It beat everyone by doing what every airline should do, and being the only one on the continent that actually did it. That is, perhaps, the most damning indictment of African aviation there is. The blueprint has been sitting in plain sight in Addis Ababa for almost 80 years. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?